Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to be talking about ecosystems and biomes, and this is going to be the last lesson of our biology unit. Beyond this point we will start with physics. So I know back at the beginning of the year I'd initially planned to do a biology unit, a chemistry unit, a geology unit, a physics unit, and an astronomy unit. The problem is with the way my schoolwork has been going this semester, and the fact that I anticipate it being about just as hard, maybe even harder next semester. I don't foresee having the time to go through all of the remaining units at the pace that we're going. Now, we've already talked about this, and we're going to move some of the geology stuff into our geography class, so it'll still get covered, just not in our science classes. Um, and after talking with you guys, we have decided to sort of skim over the chemistry, and we're going to go straight to the physics unit after the holidays. So as we've discussed at length amongst ourselves, I will hopefully be able to start making those physics videos in the next few weeks, so after my final exams, and then I will begin to upload those over the break, and you guys can start watching them after the holidays, so in the new year. So this lesson on ecosystems and biomes, I'd initially wanted this to be two separate lessons. I had wanted this to be one on ecosystems and food chains and all that stuff, and then a whole separate one on biomes. But because we're a little bit short on time with the break fast approaching, I wanted to make as few lessons as possible before your science test, so that I can make that test and get it out to you guys as soon as possible. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the test at the very end of this video, so sit tight while we talk about ecosystems and biomes, and then towards the end of it we'll talk about the test as well. So instead of focusing on both of these in as much detail as I would have originally liked, we're going to touch on both of them. We'll talk about a few sort of interesting aspects about both of these topics in one lesson, so it might be a little bit longer because of that, a little bit longer than I was originally hoping this one would be. Because of that, because I don't want to like just skim over everything. So we will spend a little bit of time on both of these. Most of the emphasis will be on the ecosystem side of it, and then we'll touch on biomes in the last few minutes. And that will be it for our biology unit. And then once again, I'm going to talk about the test just briefly at the end of the video. So we're beginning with our discussion on ecosystems. So what is an ecosystem? Well, we can define it as a system of living organisms which interact with each other. So I'm going to highlight this here so you guys can see where I'm going with it. So, system of living organisms which interact with each other and with the non-living components of their environment. So this is important because if you think about living things, or you think about living things interacting with other things, you might think of just things that are alive interacting with or reacting to the behaviors of other things that are alive, and you won't necessarily consider all of the non-living stuff that's around them. So we're going to introduce two words because we're going to be talking about these things in detail for the next few minutes. So the first of these words is biotic, and that means the living components of the ecosystem. So everything that's alive. It doesn't matter if it's an animal, a plant, a bacterium, you know, phytoplankton, none of that. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's alive, it's a biotic component of the environment. And an abiotic component of the environment is something that is non-living. So this could be something like rocks. This could be like water, the air that's being breathed in or pumped into the atmosphere from a nearby factory or whatever. Those are all abiotic components that can affect ecosystems and how well organisms are able to survive there. So ecosystems, we can say then, are made of both biotic and abiotic components. And the abiotic components are definitely important, and we need to have them in there if we want to have a discussion about how ecosystems work. So we need to think of how the living organisms depend not only on each other, whether it's organisms of the same species, like a family of lions or something. Sure, they might depend on each other. The offspring depend on the parents and stuff, um, and on having a steady food supply. But also, we need to think about how uh, living organisms, doesn't matter what organism, how it depends on the non-living and like never has been living components of the environment. So I'm not saying that like uh, a lion depends on a dead animal being nearby that it can go and eat. Uh, I'm saying how does a lion, or how does, whatever, any animal or plant or whatever, how does it depend on non-living components of the environment? How does it depend on the water? How does it depend on the air? How does it depend on the climate that's in that area? Why do these things matter? So these things all need to be considered. And one sort of key point is water, because water is essential for life, but in and of itself, water is not living. So it's an abiotic component of the environment, but without it, there wouldn't be any biotic or living components of the environment whatsoever. So this is something that to think about whenever you're having a discussion about ecosystems. So within an ecosystem, you can have many, many different types of organisms that live there. And these organisms can make up what we call the food chain. So the food chain is something that you may have heard of, and it's a similar concept to a food web. So a food chain, basically, when you're drawing it out, you have some organism down here, like a bacterium, uh, and I'm not going to actually draw out organisms because it's already hard enough to write on the screen with my laptop's touchpad. So the bacterium gets eaten by something bigger, gets absorbed by something bigger, whatever, and then that thing gets absorbed by something else, and you just show that sort of path that one thing gets absorbed by another thing, gets absorbed by another thing. You show that with these lines in here. So your food chain, you could write with lines or maybe with arrows that you've got something here, and then it gets eaten by something bigger, and then it gets eaten by something else, and in that way you can sort of draw in a food chain. And so there's a similar related concept called a food web, which basically takes many of these food chains and sort of strings them together. So maybe you have another organism here that also gets eaten by whatever this guy right here is. And maybe there's something else that also eats that. And oh, maybe one of these, also eats the other or something. And so in this way, you can have a whole bunch of different organisms. Maybe there's like a little intermediate step over here for this guy. So this one gets eaten by that, and this one gets eaten by that, um, and things like that. And then you've got this, sort of like a king of the hill type guy that just eats absolutely everything. Um, and maybe he even eats the first little guy down here directly. So you could have this big network of all of these different organisms, all and you can show how they all interact with each other, and basically what eats what in this food web. So it's a similar concept to a food chain, but what we're going to focus on is the different components of the food chain, and by that I mean the different levels that you'll find within the food chain. So if I just clear up some space, uh, let's sort of redraw one food chain that highlights the things that we're going to talk about. Actually, you know what? We'll just use this food chain over here. I'm just going to get rid of these arrows so that we can clean this up a little bit. All right, so lots of different types of organisms. And the first type that we're going to talk about are producers. We can sort of break up the organisms into these two big chunks. One group of organisms that you'll find in an ecosystem are the producers, and the second type are the consumers. So we're going to talk about the producers first. These are organisms that can make their own food and basically get their own energy from inorganic materials. Note that this is inorganic, not organic. Now, what does organic mean? We can see down here. Organic material is something that comes from living matter, so something that is living or was living, whereas inorganic material does not come from living matter. So it comes from just the stuff in the surroundings. So this could be something like water or carbon dioxide or something. Or sunlight, things like that are not organic materials. Um, so when you look at producers, producers are things that make their own food and get their own energy from inorganic materials, meaning that they don't need to eat or absorb another organism to get their energy. So one of the main examples of producers, just a broad example, is plants. Plants that, they are able to make their own food without having to absorb any already existing organism to get that energy. They're able to make their own energy using water, which is non-living, carbon dioxide, which is non-living, and sunlight, which is non-living. So they take all of these non-living components and they get their energy, which helps keep them alive. So these are producers, and if you want to be fancy, you can call them autotrophs. Um, and these two words here are basically synonymous. That a producer um, makes its own energy, and this auto part of autotroph means that it does it by itself. So in our food chain, producers are the very bottom level. They're not consuming anything else, so they're this little guy down here. It's not always going to be a small organism. It doesn't have anything to do with size. It has to do with what eats what. So plants that are able to make their own energy um, and get their own energy from inorganic materials, they make up this bottom layer, this last organism down here in the food chain. And same deal if you had a food web, and you had a whole bunch of organisms like this all around here. Hang on, let me sort of finish drawing some of this. And you've got more organisms up here, more organisms up here, and then like humans up there, and like I don't know, maybe one other creature that eats a lot of things up there. And then you draw in all your lines that of what eats what, and you get something that looks like this. I don't know if we make this like so and like so. Just make a complicated food web for the sake of it, just for fun, just so you can see that it doesn't have to be as simple as these lines that are over here on the left side. That things can be more complicated than that in your food web. So suppose we've got a food web that looks something like that. Our producers are going to be all these guys at the bottom that don't consume anything else. So maybe even like this guy right here could be a producer because these organisms don't consume anything else. There are lots and lots of producers, and then as you go up the food chain, there are less and less of the bigger guys, of these guys up at the top. You won't find nearly as many of those as you will of these guys down here. So, producers, we've talked about them now, they make up the first level of the food chain. Everything else, so that would be these guys here, and in our food web, that would be this guy, the little guy in there, this one up here, this one in here, this one in here. Anything that eats anything else, anything that gets its energy by consuming another organism, this one here, these are all consumers. So basically everything above that lowest level, these guys are all consumers. So we're going to talk about the different layers within this because you can sort of subdivide consumers into 3 different categories. So we're going to do that next. So real quick, as we've sort of discussed at length, producers get their energy from inorganic sources. That's the second bullet point right here. And just as an example, plants, as I highlighted on the previous slide, they use carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight which are all abiotic components of the environment. Abiotic components of the environment, and they use that to make their energy. They constitute what's known as the first trophic level. So basically, if you're building a so if you looked at the food web on the previous slide, unfortunately I can't really go back slides while I'm in the middle of recording, but there are lots and lots and lots of producers. So we'll have a whole bunch in the bottom row, and then we'll have some consumers here, and then we'll have these bigger, scarier consumers that there are less of, but they eat more types of things, and then, you know, maybe one guy at the top that dominates everything. So that could be like a, you know, that could be like a human, or it could be, you know, lions or sharks, you know, something that we see as a scary kind of organism in that way. So if we draw in something like this, we can see that this sort of makes a triangular shape, right? This is a really simplistic diagram. It's not necessarily reflective of any actual food web, but we can see that what we've drawn here is this sort of triangular shape, where you can see that there are lots and lots of these producers compared to the most dominant species in that food web, right? There's this one guy at the top, eats all of these things at the bottom, but there aren't that many of this guy at the top. So that's important to consider. So what we're going to be sort of building as we go through this is basically a pyramid that, so if I do this in a different color, so we'll have a pyramid where the base level is the producers. And so this base level of our pyramid, we're going to go up in steps. This base level of our pyramid is the first trophic level. So if you start drawing a pyramid, this green block right here represents all the producers, and it makes up the first trophic level. So that's the first level in this food pyramid, if you will. Next, we're going to talk about consumers, and this is where it starts to get kind of interesting. So producers, they make their own food. They, you know, they'll use the sunlight or something to get their own energy, and that's kind of the end of it, right? Now we move on to consumers. So, as we saw on the previous slide, producers get eaten by consumers, right? Producers were that bottom line, and then the consumers eat them all. So if we draw this out again, it's going to be useful to redraw that food web style diagram over and over again. So I'm just going to draw a few more in here. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's say we got 4 producers, and that's not necessarily for like individual organisms. This could be 4 species of producers, so different types of plants, for example, and then each of these, you know, dots represents a different species. So these 4 down here are all our producers, all our autotrophs, and so, you know, these guys get eaten like so. So we get something that looks like this, for example. And what we're interested in now, consumers, that's everything else. That's these 3 levels right here. So we know that producers, if I draw that again in green, producers right here, they make up what's known as the first trophic level. The next level, which is these guys right here, which I'll highlight in this yellowy orange color, this level constitutes the primary consumers. And primary consumers are strictly, so that means only, herbivores. Primary consumers are only herbivores, and we can kind of see that by looking at our little food web over here, because these guys, these primary consumers, only eat the producers down here. These are all producers, which in general are going to be plants, right? So we're not having any animals that are producers, which means that this guy here, for example, only eats this guy, which is a producer, so probably a plant, and this guy, which is also a plant. So if this one up here only eats plants, and that's its entire diet, that means it's a herbivore. And that logic works for all primary consumers. So this, just as a recap, this green box down here, this is our first trophic level, and this orangey yellow one is our second trophic level. So that's this part right here, second trophic level. So yeah, so primary consumers get their energy. Oh, I wrote right through the thing. Let's go back. Primary consumers get their energy by eating producers, by consuming autotrophs. And so some examples of this could be insects or hummingbirds or caterpillars. Caterpillars are a good one if you've ever read that book about the very hungry caterpillar. He eats through a whole bunch of things. It's not necessarily the best example because that caterpillar eats things that you wouldn't normally associate with primary consumers, but you get the idea. It eats through a leaf, so it's consuming a producer, right? It's a primary consumer and it's eating a producer. Now, the next level above that is secondary consumers. Secondary consumers. So I'm going to draw this in red. So, well, actually, first I'm going to draw these lines here in purple. So those two guys in that, those two guys up here eat these three guys down here. So if I put a red box around them, these guys make up the next level of the pyramid, and this is the third trophic level. So hopefully that pattern of the trophic levels is making sense. You just go up one. Every level you go up in this food pyramid, you add one to that number, and that's your new trophic level. So yeah, so here we've got the third trophic level. Now this food web that I've drawn isn't entirely accurate because if you look down here, so secondary consumers can get their energy by eating primary consumers. That part's fine. Oh, I wrote through it again. Hang on. So they can get their energy by eating primary consumers or by eating producers, which means I could, and probably should, draw in a little line like this down here. Right? Because that tells us that this guy eats this guy. And if this guy down here is a plant, then that means that this guy up here eats some plants and he eats some animals, like this one over here. So having that mixed diet of the two makes an organism an omnivore. So a herbivore is an organism that only eats plants. A carnivore, right here, is an organism that only eats animals. And an omnivore is one that eats both plants and animals. So you'll find some examples of secondary consumers that are carnivorous, that they only eat other animals. But then you'll also find some that that'll eat both animals and plants. So there are a few examples listed here, just like we saw for primary consumers. Snakes, spiders, bears, things like that. These make up some examples of secondary consumers. So now we're ready to move on to the next level. And the next level here is tertiary consumers. So hang on, once again, we're going to redraw that food web. So we have those four guys at the bottom. And I'm going to draw this slightly differently when I draw in the who eats what lines. So we know we've got our producers at the bottom, and we're going to say that these guys all eat, so these primary consumers in this row eat all the producers in this row. So we've got lines like this, and I'm going to draw this a little bit differently just so that it's a little bit cleaner when we're exploring this a little bit later. So I'm going to draw in this, and I'm going to draw in this, and I'm going to draw in something like that as well. And then over here, I'm only going to draw this. Okay, so what can we see? And we'll see in a second why I've drawn it in this way. So if I make in my green box like so, I draw in my green box like so. There's our producers. That's our first trophic level, number 1. And then with our orange box, we've got our second trophic level. That's the primary consumers right here. That's number 2. That's number 2. And then in red, we've got our secondary consumers. So that's, oops, a little high there. That's this one right here. There we go. That's our third trophic level. And then now we've got our tertiary consumers, and that's in black. This is going to be the top of the pyramid. That's this guy up here. Now, what does he eat? This one at the top. Now, a tertiary consumer, once again, can be a carnivore or an omnivore, which means that it might just eat animals, might eat animals and plants. This is the fourth trophic level. Right here, you can see that fourth trophic level. So let's mark in a little 4. There we go. And now let's mark in what this guy eats. So we can see that a tertiary consumer gets his energy by eating. Well, we've got secondary consumers. That makes sense. Secondary consumers, that's the third trophic level. That's these guys right here. So I can draw in lines like so. He eats that guy and he eats that guy. There we go. We've got our tertiary consumer eating both of those. But he can also eat a primary consumer, and that's our second trophic level. That's this guy down here, this yellow block. So maybe he also eats this guy right here in the second trophic level. And a tertiary consumer might also eat producers. So producers are our first trophic level, and there are plants. And so if we have a tertiary consumer that eats plants, then that makes it omnivorous, an omnivore. And here's why I didn't draw in a purple line connecting all of the primary consumers to all of the secondary consumers, is so that I have this clear path right here, this straight shot from our tertiary consumer at the top to this producer at the bottom. So you can get a food web that looks something like that. Now obviously you could draw in more lines. You could draw in a line like so, like that there, to show that, you know, this secondary consumer also eats this primary consumer. But in general, you can see now that we've got, so if I use an entirely different color, light blue, so we've got that our primary consumers eat our producers, so that's these guys right here. We've got our secondary consumers, so that's our third trophic level. They eat some primary consumers and they eat some producers, right? That's both of those. And then we've got, I'll do this in another color just for clarity. We'll do this in a dark blue. Will that come out looking all right? Let's do it in green, because we only used green at the very bottom there. So here we've got our apex predator, or our tertiary consumer. This is our king of the hill, top of the food chain kind of guy. And he eats everything. He eats secondary consumer, he eats this primary consumer, and he eats this producer down here. So as you go up the food chain, you might find more variety, but also in general you find less numbers. If you have if you have 1,000 of these producers, then you might only have 100 of your primary consumers, you might only have 10 of your secondary consumers, and you might only have one apex predator, one tertiary consumer, this guy. So the numbers do decrease in that way. Oh, and I never put in examples of tertiary consumers, but let's write one in. The main one that we can all think of, humans. We are an example of a tertiary consumer because we eat a lot of things. We are the end of the line for a lot of different food chains. And you could think of other animals that go into that sort of category. You know, if you're thinking about marine life, if you're thinking about organisms that live in the ocean, what are the scariest things that live in the ocean? You might think of sharks or something like that. There are probably sharks that are at the top of their food chain, if you're not counting the fact that maybe some of them are hunted and eaten by humans. But there are lots and lots of different organisms that in their own environments, they are the apex predators. They're the scariest of the lot when it comes to all the other organisms that live in that area. They all watch out for the tertiary consumer. But in our modern world, humans really are tertiary consumers and apex predators pretty much of the whole planet because we eat a lot of different things. We are the top of the food chain in so many different food chains that we're basically not even a part of the food chain anymore because all roads lead to us. So that's sort of a main example right there, possibly on your test, just because I left out examples here. When it comes time for your test, maybe I'll ask you to go digging for a couple of other examples of some tertiary consumers. And then now down here at the bottom, we can also talk about the last sort of category that doesn't really fit into the pyramid that I've drawn up here, but these are the decomposers. These are the ones that eat all the dead stuff. So everything that's in this food pyramid up here is stuff that's been eaten by is a living organism that's been eaten by another living organism. So usually, in the food chain, you'll find one organism that chases down its food. When it comes to these detritivores and these decomposers down here, they don't really do that. They wait for organisms to die, and then they get their energy by sort of liquefying the contents of that organism and absorbing the nutrients that way. So you'll get fungi, things like mushrooms and stuff, and earthworms that feast on dead stuff, dead and decaying stuff, and that's what sort of completes this cycle of getting nutrients into organisms and then getting it back into the environment, getting it back into the soil and things like that, so that a new generation of species, a new generation of plants can grow once you get those nutrients back into the soil, and things like that. So they're the last sort of component that's worth mentioning, but we're not really considering them in any great detail in our diagram. So here's just another picture of trophic levels. So you can see some examples. We got plants down here at the bottom. This is the thumbnail from a YouTube video that I found on Google. So I didn't make this. So we got plants down here. Then they get eaten by, or at least partially consumed by, our primary consumers here. Then we've got secondary consumers, so a slightly larger animal, and then an even larger animal makes up the fourth trophic level, but the tertiary consumers. So that's sort of an example of how you can sort of build these trophic level diagrams. Now obviously we use different colors. We use green at the bottom, then yellow, then red, then black. The colors don't really matter. That was just to give you guys an idea of where each trophic level starts and ends. But this is just sort of a cleaner version of it. And you can see again that there are less of these guys than there are of these guys down here. So that goes along with the numbers thing that we mentioned as well. So now just for a couple of slides, this is the only one I think that has text on it, and then the rest of them are some images that we're just going to talk about for a couple of minutes. We're going to think about what they mean. We're moving on now to biomes. So what is a biome? Well, a biome is a community of organisms that share some common traits. And the way I mean the traits in this sense is that these organisms are all sort of connected based on where they live. So they'll live in a region with a very distinct climate, a climate that's unique to that area, and maybe it's a reasonably large area across the planet. So something like polar ice caps, they're not particularly small, but you also won't find them everywhere around the world. Same deal with deserts. You might find some really large deserts, but you're not going to find desert type climates all around the world, and therefore you won't find the same types of organisms all around the world. Animals that live in the desert have to deal with the struggles of living in the desert, where it's either, really, really hot if it's something like the Sahara, or really, really cold if it's something like the Antarctic, and one way or another, no precipitation. So they got to find some way to, find enough water and find enough food, because it's really hard to live in the desert. So organisms in specific biomes, they'll be united in that way, that they share some sort of characteristic which might reflect some of the challenges of the environment, like with deserts. Another example you could think of is organisms that live in the rainforest in the Amazon or something, that have a really potent venom. You'll see these trends that certain areas of the world, like the Amazon or Australia, have lots and lots of venomous uh, species. Things that either you touch it and it kills you, it excretes some sort of poisonous substance, or it bites you and then you get sick. You'll see these in specific parts of the world, but not everywhere. And so this can be related to the idea of biomes. And we can actually also relate this concept of a biome to the idea of a microbiome. And a microbiome gives us sort of a human scale to what biomes are and how they work. So a microbiome is the collection of microorganisms, so this is like bacteria and viruses and stuff, that live on the skin, like on the surface of a human, so on the skin or in the hair, or eyelash mites kinds of things. They'll live just on the outside or inside a human body. So things like the bacteria in your gut and stuff like that. So there's lots of stuff that lives on or in humans, but overall the environment is not that different. I mean, sure, the environment on the outside of the human body is different from on the inside of the human body, different temperatures versus, it's much warmer inside the body than out, and things like that. There are some differences, but the bacteria that you'll find in one part of the body aren't the same as the bacteria that you'll find in another part of the body. So there are still differences, but overall they all depend on whatever the human body has to offer them. They all find some niche in or on a human where they can thrive. So with biomes, it's kind of similar, that you'll have these regions of the planet that in some way or another they provide something to this specific group of organisms that can live there, and other organisms are simply not well equipped to live in such a location. So we'll have a look at a couple of diagrams of some biomes, and then we'll talk just a bit for a couple of minutes after that, and then we'll get to our discussion on the test. So here's a diagram you might find if you Google the different biomes on the Earth. So you can see here, I'll just highlight a few. We're not going to go through all of these down the left because that's a lot. But you can notice a few. Tundra, really cold, usually pretty dry. These kinds of areas up here. So we've got northern Canada, we've got northern Greenland, we've got northern Russia. I drew that arrow a little bit too far, but you get the idea. Right, hang on, let's redraw that. Northern Russia, right here. These islands here, around where Svalbard, Norway is. We've got this little bit of tundra inside Iceland there as well. And then it's not shown here, but the edges of Antarctica might also show up with a tundra type climate. Ice sheets, we've got a massive ice sheet right here. Greenland and Antarctica, once again, would be the other significant one. But we got lots and lots of different things here. We've got subtropical rainforests, so we got some rainforests, and so down here, tropical rainforests. So subtropical rainforests and tropical rainforests, you can see they're in this kind of area here, a little bit up here as well. So in these equatorial regions, right, subtropical and tropical regions, it's all going to be around the equator. And for context, the equator is around here. This is not going to be a perfectly straight line, and also probably not a completely accurate one, but the equator is somewhere around there. So we can see that it makes sense that our tropical regions fit in a space that's like here-ish. Makes sense to be on just either side of the equator, and that's about it. And same deal we can see over here. We've got some tropical rainforests in this kind of area as well. Now, as we've talked before, not at great lengths, deserts. You can find that deserts occur in some really specific regions of the planet. So you won't find them right at the equator, because the equator is this line right here. Right around the equator is where you find a lot of these rainforests, and in the case of Africa, also these savannas in this area right here. But up here, hang on, let me use a more visible color, like this dark blue. Right here, we can see that there's a very large desert that extends from here in Africa and basically goes all the way to over here, beyond the edge of the Middle East. And then up here, we've got some additional mountainous regions and also some deserts in there as well. So the mountainous region corresponds to this alpine tundra right here, corresponds to this massive block of this pale bluish type color. But when it comes to the deserts, you can see that it's up here. It's a little distance away from the equator, right? The desert fits in up there. And then same deal down here with this, or with this in Australia and Namibia. The Namibia one is this one over here. Once again, it's some distance away from the equator, right? So there are these patterns, and there are geographical and geological reasons for some of the different things that we see when it comes to talking about these biomes. But you can see that there are lots and lots of different ways to classify, an area of the planet based on the organisms that live there and the common climate patterns and things like that. So this is just one example of a biome diagram. Now we're going to look at a second one. So this one has a much more sort of granular view. Instead of just a big bunch of wavy lines, they've got these really, really specific details. If you look down here in South America, they've got these really specific starting and ending points for all of these different areas. They've still got a huge list of biomes. Once again, we can see the tundra up here in Canada and in Greenland, and now we can see it in Antarctica as well, and over here in Russia. So we've got lots of that. We've got this here represents grasslands, savannas, and shrublands. So that covers a large extent of. Actually, well, that's not so much. This one corresponds to this one right here. This tropical and subtropical grasslands and savannas. That corresponds to this over here. The temperate one corresponds to more like this one right here. But yeah, you can see that these tropical and subtropical grasslands, once again, the equator is somewhere around here. This is, once again, not a perfect diagram, but somewhere around there. And so it makes sense that our tropical and subtropical stuff is going to show up in this kind of area, not that far from the equator. Once again, we can see that pattern with the deserts. Desert right here. See here, deserts gets that kind of really light color. Desert here, and that extends a long way into Asia, right? But we can see all of these different areas, and we can notice these patterns with where different biomes show up. We can see, once again, we can see rainforests. We've got flooded grasslands and savannas, so lots and lots of different things to look at here. One thing that's important to note, though, is that even though they've made all of these little details, like the ones that we see over here, where they've said, oh, this part here is a savanna, but this part here is something else. This part here is a rainforest, and same thing over here. If you're looking at Africa, we've got a little bit of, we've got like 3 different colors. In this incredibly tiny section right here, you'll find like 3 or 4 different colors in there representing 3 or 4 different types of biomes. And it should be noted that uh, the biomes tend to sort of gradually go from one to the next, and that's what we're going to see in the next slide, is that it gradually transitions from this biome to that one, and it's really hard to draw in a definitive line that this biome starts precisely here. You know, if you go to this corner of East Africa, you're not going to see the landscape change like a line in the sand, that, you know, you've got sand on one side and then you've got grass on the other, or like, you know, you've got a highway and on one side you've got a savanna and on the other you've got a rainforest. It's not going to look like that because the change is much more gradual, and we're going to see that on the next slide. So here we can just see, you don't have to worry about all these different things, like all these different words and stuff, especially the ones like potential evapotranspiration ratio. We don't have to worry about words like that. What I want you to concentrate on is the colored stuff inside this triangle over here. You can see some of the different names that we've come across while looking at these biomes. We've got tundra, we've got deserts, we've got rainforests, um, lots and lots of different things, and there are a bunch of these other names that if you go back, you'll see some of these names uh, show up uh, in our diagram. But what I want you to pay attention to here is how it's sort of decided by this, which we don't really have to talk about, this potential evapotranspiration ratio, and annual precipitation, so how much it rains or snows. And it transitions from one biome to the next, and it's a pretty gradual shift. You know, if you start at this dry tundra, it's a gradual shift to a moist tundra, to a wet tundra, to a rain tundra, to a rainforest, things like that. You know, as the humidity increases, you go from a dry tundra towards a wet one, and as the latitude gets closer and closer to tropical, then you start going down this way, right? So if you go from a dry tundra, which is, you know, really far up north and pretty dry, uh, you know, arid just means dry. So we've got, if we start here at dry tundra, it's dry, it's subpolar, so really up north or really far south, um, and it's a gradual shift going from dry tundra towards something like rainforests. It's a gradual shift, and you'll pass through all of these different biomes in the middle on your way from a subpolar arid tundra type biome to something like a super humid tropical rainforest. So all of the different biomes, and obviously we haven't seen all of the names here that we've seen on the previous slides, but what I want to highlight to you is that they're all sort of connected in this way. And so you can see how hopefully this helps you justify that it's a gradual shift from one to the next. Now there might be some more extreme shifts. If you go from a desert plain to a mountain range, then yeah, you might find a pretty abrupt change in biome there. But in general, going from one part of the planet to another, the latitude change, this is a gradual thing. The altitude change, this is also generally a reasonably gradual thing. Annual precipitation patterns don't have these definitive lines that I will rain and snow this much on this side of the line and not at all on this side of the line. It's a gradual change, and so we have this gradual shift from one biome to the next. And this last one, for you guys to take a look at, we can see that there's a comparison that if you compare the average annual temperature in degrees Celsius and you compare the amount of rainfall or snowfall, this sort of tells you what kind of biome you can expect to see given those conditions. So if it's always about, let's say, 27 degrees Celsius and it's, you know, 250 centimeters of precipitation per year, then if you just draw a line kind of going across 250 and up from about 27 degrees, you'll hit somewhere around here. So maybe a tropical rainforest or maybe a tropical seasonal forest or savanna, you know, somewhere right around this point is just about the boundary between the two. But so this can sort of help you visualize where you can find the different where you can find these different biomes, because there is this connection between the temperature, the annual average temperature. So, the colder it is, this is like, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius on average, you'll get a boreal forest. Or if it really doesn't precipitate very much at all, then you might get this woodland or cold desert type thing down here. So you can just take a look at this and experiment by choosing a different precipitation and a different temperature and see which one you end up on. So this, I just thought it would be a neat way for you guys to see how these are sort of connected, and this can also hopefully justify for you guys that that there's sort of a gradual shift, even though there's definitive lines blocking off one one biome from the next. You can hopefully understand that going from woodland here to savanna over there, it's just a matter of a few degrees change in average annual temperature. So probably if you're, right here and right here, it's probably not going to look super different as compared to if you were over here and over here. So there are definitely going to be places where it looks very different. Here it's always 10 degrees Celsius and here it's always 30 degrees Celsius and rains twice as much or 4 times as much or something. Then there will be differences. But hopefully you can see from this and from the previous slide or two that there are pretty gradual changes from one biome to the next. So unfortunately this lesson has gone on for a bit longer than I thought it would, and a bit longer than I hoped it would. But now we're going to wrap up. This is the last slide, so I'm just going to take a minute to point out a couple of things for your test. So as of the time of recording, today is the 3rd of December, and it should be uploaded the same day, so that shouldn't come as a surprise when you watch this. But because we're so close to the holidays, you guys will probably be off school in the next 2 weeks-ish. I don't want to stuff the test into this really, really short period in case it's not enough time, because I know I've also given you guys your geography test that is just finishing up and your math test, which is due next week. But we will be wrapping this up in the weeks to come. So I will hopefully have the test made and uploaded in the next few days, so you do have time to work on it before the break. But if you don't get enough time before then, I know you guys have your history projects and things like that due as well. Just for that, so that you don't have to worry about finishing it at the beginning of your holidays, I'm going to make the due date for the test sometime in the middle of January, maybe towards the end of January, if I don't get to make the test in the next couple of days. So I will probably have the test uploaded, like I said, in the next 2-3 days tops. If not, if it's a little bit later, then I'll upload the test at the start of your holidays, and it'll be due like a month later. So if I upload the test on December 20th or 21st, it won't be due until about January 20th, maybe 25th, in that range, somewhere there. And that's to make sure that you guys have enough time to get through all the material, ask your questions, do a little bit of extra reading if you wish. If you find this stuff interesting and you want to learn more, then I want to give you guys the time to do that before we jump headfirst into another unit. But that is it for our biology unit. I know there was a lot more that we could have covered, but as I've said before, and as most of you know, biology and chemistry aren't really my areas of expertise. So now hopefully we can get into some more involved discussions with our next 2 units, which will take up the rest of the school year. We'll be discussing physics and astronomy for most of the rest of the year, and those 2 areas are my bread and butter, if you will. Those are the 2 topics that I study extensively at university, so hopefully it'll be just as fun for you guys as it will be for me. So with that, I will let you guys go. Good luck with your studying and for this test, and I will see you at the beginning of the physics unit. Have a good one.